The autumn that year came early to Ashfield Park, stripping the linden trees before September had properly finished, and the servants whispered that it was fitting. They whispered a great many things, the servants of Ashfield, and they did it with the particular discretion of people who had learned that the Earl of Ashfield did not forgive loose tongues, though they could not entirely help themselves when the subject at hand was the new housekeeper. She had arrived on a Tuesday, which was an unremarkable day for an unremarkable arrival. The carter from the village had brought her trunk, a modest affair in black lacquered wood with a brass clasp, and she had walked the last quarter-mile herself, because it had not occurred to anyone to send the carriage, and because she had not asked. She was called Mrs. Hartfield. She came with a single letter of reference, written in a solicitor's careful hand, and she answered every question put to her in a low, clear voice that gave nothing away. She was perhaps 26, perhaps a year older. It was difficult to tell. Her dark hair was drawn back so tightly it seemed almost severe, and her gown was gray, and the only thing that was not gray about her was her eyes, which were a particular warm brown, almost amber, and which had a way of settling on a person with great stillness, as though they had decided to remember. Mr. Callow, the steward, had interviewed her in the green parlor. He had asked her about her experience, and she had answered without hesitation. He had asked about her previous position, and she had said it had been in Somerset, a private household now dissolved, and she had the letter to attest. He had asked about her references, and she had offered the solicitor's name and address and said he might write if he wished. He had asked, finally, why she wanted a position at Ashfield Park specifically, and she had said that she had heard they were in want of one, and that she was in want of a position, and that these two facts seemed sufficient. He had hired her on the spot. Ashfield Park had been without a proper housekeeper for 3 months, since Mrs. Beale had retired to her sister's in Bath, and the house had begun to feel it. There were larder accounts that wanted auditing, and a linen press that had grown chaotic, and the under-housemaids had developed a habit of idleness that had begun to spread like damp in the walls. Mrs. Hartfield was not idle. By the end of her first week, the linen press was reorganized, the larder accounts were corrected and reconciled, and the under-housemaids had quietly resumed their proper habits, not because Mrs. Hartfield had raised her voice, and she had not, but because she had a way of appearing in doorways at precisely the wrong moment, and a way of looking at a half-made bed or an undusted dado that was more effective than any amount of scolding. The cook said she was thorough. The first footman said she was quietly unnerving. The eldest under-housewoman, Polly, said she was kind, and that her hands were cold in the mornings, and that sometimes she looked at the portrait gallery as though she had a right to. The Earl of Ashfield had not yet set eyes on her. He was not at Ashfield Park when she arrived. He was in London, attending to estate business, which was to say he was attending to the particular form of estate business that consisted of sitting in a solicitor's office and being told, in measured tones, exactly what 3 years of his own inattention had cost. He returned on a Thursday in the 2nd week of October, and he arrived late, having taken the road from York in the dark because he had not wished to stop, and his horse's breath made white clouds in the cold air as the groom brought him round, and the house was lit in its lower windows against the night. He was 34 years old, Edmund Rowe, the Earl of Ashfield. He was tall and broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had been active in his youth and had not yet been indolent long enough to lose it entirely. His hair was dark, close-cropped at the sides in the fashion of the day. His face was a composed face, angular, with a jaw that had a habit of tightening before he spoke, and eyes of a particular gray-green that people found difficult to hold, not because they were unkind, but because they were very precise and very attentive in a way that felt, if one was not used to it, uncomfortably like being read. He had been told that he was severe. He had not disputed it. There were reasons for severity that were no one's business but his own. He ate alone, as he had done for 3 years, and he did not ask for the housekeeper to be presented to him that night. He would see her in the morning, if he had to see her at all. He had hired and discharged 3 housekeepers in as many years, and he had found the ritual of introduction tedious in its repetition. He was in the library at 8 in the morning when she knocked. She came in quietly. The new housekeeper. And she stood at the appropriate distance. And she said, "My lord, I am Mrs. Hartfield. I apologize for the hour." Her voice was exactly as Callow had described it, low, clear, giving nothing. Edmund looked up from the account ledger he had been studying, and then he was very still for a long moment. It was not the stillness because she was beautiful, though she was, in a composed and unfashionable way, what might have been called handsome. It was not because she was unexpected. It was something else, something he could not immediately account for, a sensation at the back of his neck that was adjacent to recognition, and not quite it, like hearing a phrase of music that one cannot quite place, but is certain one has heard before. "Mrs. Hartfield," he said. His voice was level. "Sit down." She sat, precisely, without unnecessary adjustment, in the chair he had indicated, and she produced from her apron pocket a small leather notebook and opened it to the first page. She said she had taken the liberty of preparing a brief account of the household's present state, and she presented it, and he read it, and it was thorough and correctly prioritized and written in a small, even hand that he found himself studying for a fraction of a second too long before he turned his attention to its contents. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 without consulting the notebook. He noted that she knew the household's accounts to within a few shillings without looking, and that when she spoke of the under-housemaids, she used their names. He told her she might go. She rose, tucked the notebook away, and moved toward the door. And it was only as she reached it, as she turned slightly to close it behind her, that he noticed the way she moved. A certain careful economy, as though she were accustomed to taking up as little room as possible. He had seen that quality before. He could not say where. She pulled the door closed. He sat for a while with his hand on the ledger and did not turn its page. In the village, the talk ran a different course, as village talk tends to. The servants who lived in the cottages and came daily carried it home with them. The new housekeeper was efficient, they said. That she was quiet. That she did not mix exactly. But she was not cold. That there was something about her. The blacksmith's wife said she had very good teeth for a woman of her station, which was an observation of the sort that sounds trivial and is not. The apothecary's wife said she had met her in the lane and found her to speak with unusual precision, and that she did not speak like a woman who had spent her life in service. The vicar said that he had seen her in church on Sunday, and that she had sat alone in the back pew and sung the responses without looking at the book. None of this reached the Earl's ears. He was not, at present, in the habit of listening to village talk. He was in the habit, however, of the library in the early mornings, and the library was adjacent to the still room, and the still room in October required daily attention, and Mrs. Hartfield was not the sort of woman to delegate what she could supervise herself. It happened, therefore, quite without any deliberate arrangement on either side, that they were often briefly in proximity before the household properly woke, and in those early hours the house had a different quality, quieter and more honest somehow, and Edmund found himself attending to things he had not attended to for some time. He noticed that she had a small scar at the outer edge of her left wrist, pale and old, the kind left by a childhood burn. He noticed that when she thought she was unobserved, she sometimes paused at the window at the end of the east corridor and looked out over the kitchen garden with an expression that was not quite sadness and was not quite something else. He noticed that she knew where every book in the library was shelved, which was not, strictly speaking, knowledge a housekeeper needed. He did not ask about any of these things. He asked about the larder and the linen accounts, and whether the chimneys in the east wing had been swept before winter. And she answered all of it in the same level voice, with the same stillness. And he did not ask anything more. She had been at Ashfield Park for 3 weeks when he came upon her in the gallery. He had come up the back stair from the estate room, intending to cut through to the south parlor, and he had heard nothing, which was itself the thing that made him pause before he turned the corner. Silence in the gallery was ordinary. Yet Mrs. Hartfield was standing before the large portrait near the east window, the one that had hung there for 4 years, and she was not moving. It was a portrait in oil, not large by the standards of the gallery, commissioned 3 years ago, completed 3 years ago, hung 3 years ago, in a ceremony that had been no ceremony at all, but only Edmund instructing Callow to have it hung, and then leaving the room. It showed a young woman of perhaps 22, seated in a pale gown, with dark hair dressed in the style of the previous decade, and a small smile that the painter had caught with a fidelity that still unsettled Edmund when he allowed himself to think about it. Beneath it was a small brass plate. The brass plate read, "In Memoriam. Lady Rowena Rowe, Countess of Ashfield, beloved wife." Mrs. Hartfield stood before it with her hands folded at her waist. Her back was to him. He did not speak. He stood at the corner of the gallery and watched her for a moment, and in that moment, something that had been sitting at the edge of his understanding for 3 weeks moved one step closer to the center of it. Something about the line of her shoulders, the way she held her chin, the particular quality of her stillness before that face. He stepped back before she turned. He went the long way round to the south parlor and stood at its window for several minutes looking out at the park, at the linden trees stripped bare, and the sky the color of cold pewter, and he thought about a great many things that he had not let himself think about in 3 years. It would be useful here to explain the portrait, not what it showed, but what had preceded it. 3 years ago, Edmund had married. He had married quickly, because his solicitor had informed him that the estate's affairs were in a condition that required a substantial infusion of either capital or attention, and Edmund had been disposed to neither, and there was the additional consideration of his grandmother's health, which was then poor and is now irrelevant, because the Dowager Countess had died the previous spring, but which had been, at the time, a pressure of its own. He had married Rowena Ashford, the only daughter of a baronet in Northumberland, who was 21 and composed and brought a respectable sum to the marriage, and had seemed, when he met her at her cousin's dinner table, both sensible and unlikely to make unreasonable demands. He had not, to speak plainly, been very attentive in the months that followed. He had thought himself attentive to what mattered. The capital infused, the dowager satisfied, the estate accounts in better order. He had thought himself kind in a general and adequate way. He had not, he told himself afterward, been unkind to her specifically. He had simply not been present in any way that mattered, and he had not asked what she needed, and he had not noticed the way her smile in the portrait had been painted from a sitting she attended alone, with only the painter for company, because her husband had not thought to attend. She had left him at the end of their first year of marriage, not with drama, not without drama, in fact, which had been worse. She had left a letter, carefully worded, in a hand he had to stop himself from studying, because he knew the hand, had always known it was precise and small and never smudged, and the letter said that she did not believe she was well suited to the life of Ashfield Park, and that she hoped he would be content, and that she was sorry for the inconvenience. She had signed it, Rowena Rowe. Not Rowena. Not the wife he had not properly known. He had not found her. He had tried, briefly, out of obligation rather than feeling, and then had told himself that a woman who wished to disappear had that right. He had covered the mirror in his dressing room, which was a habit of grief, and then had uncovered it. Because he was not, he said, grieving. He had commissioned the portrait from her wedding miniature, because the dowager had said it was the proper thing to do, and he had hung it, and he had told himself that the proper thing was done. In memoriam, as though she were dead, as though he had buried her. He had not been back to the gallery since. Mrs. Hartfield appeared in the library doorway the following morning at 7, as she had done every morning, and she said the usual things, and he said the usual things, and it was precisely as it had been for 3 weeks, and entirely unlike it, because now he was looking. Not rudely. He was never rude. He was attentive, though, in that precise way of his, to details he had not previously catalogued. The small scar at her wrist, which he had noticed before. The fact that when she sat at a particular slight angle, not quite facing the center of the room, which was a learned habit. The habit of a woman accustomed to rooms in which she was not quite supposed to take up space. The fact that her voice had a particular quality at certain vowels, a quality that he had heard before from a woman who had grown up in Northumberland and come south and smoothed most of it away, but never all. The fact that her eyes, when they rested on the window, had a way of looking at the kitchen garden with the concentrated attention of someone who was learning it rather than someone who had never needed to learn it. He said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. 3 years of practice had made him excellent at it. It was Callow who brought the thing to a head, not intentionally. Callow was delivering the weekly account summary, and he mentioned, in his methodical way, that Mrs. Hartfield had written to the chandler in York about the winter supply of candles and had negotiated the order at a rate 4 shillings per gross, below what the previous housekeeper had managed, and that the chandler had noted in his return letter that he had been pleased to do business with Lady Ashfield again. Callow had not thought anything of it. He assumed it was an error. He mentioned it only because he thought Edmund might wish to know about the saving on the candles. Edmund sat with that word, again. For a long time after Callow had gone, he went to her that afternoon, not in the library, where they had their measured and professional exchanges, but in the still room, where she was making the winter inventory, and where she was alone, and where she could not, quite, maintain the professional distance she had maintained with such great care. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. He watched her see him looking, really looking, and he watched something change in her face, a brief and involuntary thing, a slight widening of the amber eyes before they went carefully composed again. He said, "Rowena." She did not deny it. He had not thought she would, if he said it plain. She was not a woman who lied about the things that mattered. She was quiet for a moment, her hand still holding the pen above the inventory ledger, and then she set the pen down with great deliberateness, and she said, "I did not think you would recognize me." Her voice was the same voice. He had known it for 3 weeks and had not let himself know it. "The chandler," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. "I did not think he would write it. He is not the issue." Edmund came into the room, which was small, and the smallness of it made itself felt. He stopped at the appropriate distance, the distance that was not quite appropriate, and he said in a voice that was doing considerable work to remain level, "Why did you come back?" She looked at him directly. Then, the way she had always looked at him when he asked her a direct question, the quality of attention that had always made him feel, slightly uncomfortably, that she was seeing him more accurately than he was seeing himself. She said, "I needed to understand whether you had changed." She said it simply, without self-pity, without accusation. A plain fact. And if I had not, then I would have stayed through the winter and gone in spring, and you would not have known. He stood with that for a moment. The still room smelled of dried lavender and beeswax, and outside the small window the linden trees moved in the afternoon wind, and it was very quiet. He said, "That is not a charitable reading of me." "No," she said. It was not. I had reason for it, however. This was true. He knew it was true. He had known it was true for 3 years, in a dim and unwilling way. And what was happening now was that the dim was becoming specific, which was considerably more uncomfortable. He said, "The portrait." She said carefully, "I had not intended to go to the gallery." "But you did." She was quiet again, and then she said, "It was strange to see it. I had not thought you would commission it. It seemed like grief." "It was guilt," he said. It came out more plainly than he had intended. He watched it land, and he watched her receive it, and he noticed that she did not look satisfied by it, the way a woman who wanted him to suffer would have done. She looked only steadier, as though something she had suspected had been confirmed, and she was deciding what to do with the confirmation. He said, "I owe you a more honest accounting than I gave you in our first year. I know that. I knew it before you left. Which is the part I cannot make smaller." His voice was level, still, but the jaw was tight in the way it got tight before things that cost him. "I did not know you. I thought knowing you was incidental to the arrangement, and I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong, and I did not correct it until it was too late to correct." Rowena looked at him for a long moment. She had very still hands, usually. At present, one of them was resting on the inventory ledger and was not quite still. She said, "You are telling me this now because you are afraid I will leave again." "I am telling you this now," he said, "because I have been telling it to a portrait for 3 years, and it deserves to be said to you." The still room was very quiet. Then she said, "I came back in the autumn. I knew you would return in October. I knew because you always return in October, when the accounts come due, and because some habits do not change even when other things do." She paused. "I wanted to see if you were different. Or if I was. Or if the house was still the sort of house a woman could not live in without becoming invisible inside it." He said, "And?" She said quietly, "You learned the names of the under-housemaids." He did not know what to do with that, exactly, but he recognized that it mattered. He said, "I am told you know them as well." "I always have," she said. "You simply were not attending." This was also true. He was attending now. He was attending to the small scar at her wrist, and to the fine line of her collarbone above the gray gown's modest collar, and to the particular amber of her eyes in the late afternoon light through the still room window, and to the fact that he had sat opposite her in their dining room for a year and had not truly attended to any of it, which was a form of waste he could now see with perfect clarity, and no pleasure at all. He said, "I would like to begin again." The words were careful, but they were not cold. He had worked very hard not to be cold in this room today. She looked at him steadily. "I would need it to be different. I know." "Not promises," she said. "I do not want promises. I want She stopped and caught herself and started again, more carefully. I want to be known this time. I want you to ask me things, not about the larder. Something that had been held very tightly in Edmund's chest for approximately 3 years shifted slightly. He said, "Tell me something then. Something that is not about the larder." She was quiet for a moment, and then, in a voice that was smaller and more honest than her housekeeper's voice, she said, "I played the pianoforte every evening in Somerset, in the house where I was companion, because there was one, and it was permitted, and because in the evenings I could pretend that I was someone who had a right to things. I have not sat at your pianoforte once." He said, "You have a right to it." He said it plainly, and he meant it, and it was not, on the face of it, a weighty thing to say, but she received it as though it were, as though the granting of a right to a pianoforte were a significant event, which it was, because it was not about the pianoforte. "Edmund," he said, "my name is Edmund. You stopped using it." "I stopped using it," she said, "when it felt presumptuous." "It is not presumptuous." She looked at him for a long, still moment, and then she said quietly, "Edmund." She said it the way one says a word for the first time after a very long time of knowing it, carefully, as though to check that it still had the same weight. It did. He felt it. If you have stayed with this story until this moment, then you know what it is that Rowena had been looking for, and what she had not allowed herself to expect. You know it because you have been watching her do the small daily work of dignity, the accounts reconciled, the housemaids learning their habits again, the chandler negotiated into fairness, and because you have felt what it costs a woman to do that work in a house where no one knows who she is. Leave a quiet comment, if you have felt that, in whatever house you have loved and been invisible in. This story is not finished yet. She did not, that day, abandon the position of Mrs. Hartfield. There were practical matters that required addressing, which is to say, there was a household that required managing, and there was the village talk, which would require very careful handling, and there was the small matter of what the Dowager Countess's old friends would say when they learned what had happened, which was that the Countess of Ashfield had been living in her own house as a servant for 2 months, and that the Earl had not recognized her, and that the Earl had, when he did recognize her, stood in the still room and spoken plainly about guilt. These were not, by the standards of the Regency social machinery, small matters. Edmund went to see his solicitor, Mr. Fairclough, the following week. He went in person, which was not usual, and he said that he required a letter drafted to his wife's former solicitor confirming the end of the separation, and that the title deed for the Northumberland property she had brought to the marriage ought to be transferred into her name independently of his, which was her right under the terms of her settlement, and which he had previously managed in a passive and insufficient way. Mr. Fairclough wrote it with great care, and asked no questions, which was why Edmund had employed him for 12 years. There was also the matter of Lady Beaumont, who had been present at their wedding, and who was the Dowager's oldest friend, and who had come to stay at Ashfield Park with her niece in November, which visit had been arranged before Rowena's return, and could not, without considerable rudeness, be cancelled. It was Lady Beaumont's niece who provided the occasion, as such people often do, without meaning to. Miss Louisa Kemp was 20 and fair, and had been told since her debut that she was the kind of woman who would make an excellent countess. She had been told it so frequently, and in so many drawing-rooms, that she had come to believe it was simply a matter of locating the correct Earl. She was not unkind. She was, in the way of people who have been assured of their own value for too long, simply very certain of herself, and that certainty had a way of expressing itself in small frictions with women she did not consider her social equals. She had been at Ashfield Park for 3 days when she made the observation in the yellow morning room while Lady Beaumont and 2 other visiting women were present that the housekeeper was an oddly superior creature for the position. She said it pleasantly, with a slight smile. She said that there was something curious about a housekeeper who spoke as well as Mrs. Hartfield, and held herself as Mrs. Hartfield did, and had such very fine eyes for a woman who had spent her life in service. Lady Beaumont, who was 73 and had known the previous Dowager Countess for 40 years, went very still in her chair. She looked at Miss Kemp, and then she looked at the doorway, which Mrs. Hartfield had just vacated, and then she looked back at Miss Kemp, and something moved across her face that was not yet certainty, but was very close to it. She said nothing. She was old, and she was wise, and she said nothing. And she watched. She saw Edmund at dinner. She sat 2 seats from him, and she watched him in the way she had watched men at dinner for 50 years. And she saw him attend to things. And she saw him notice when Rowena refilled the wine on the sideboard. And she saw the slight shift in his posture when Rowena passed through the room. And she understood, with the accuracy of a woman who had observed a great many marriages, what she was looking at. After dinner, she drew him aside, into the east sitting room, and she said, without preamble, "She has come back to you." Not a question. Edmund looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Yes." Lady Beaumont said, "She is a housekeeper," he said. "She is the Countess of Ashfield." She looked at him steadily. She had black eyes, still sharp at 73, and she had known Edmund since he was a child. And she said, "Does she know you understand that distinction?" He said, "I am working to make it clear to her." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You were not good to her, Edmund, in the first year." "I know it. She is too dignified to say so." "I know that too." Lady Beaumont sat down, slowly, in the chair nearest the window, and she was quiet for a time, and then she said, "I liked her when she married you. I thought she was too quiet. And then I thought that the quiet was not emptiness but capacity, and that you would be a fortunate man if you understood the difference." She paused. "You did not, then?" "No," he said, "I did not." She looked at him steadily. "And now?" He said, "I am asking her things. She told me she plays the pianoforte." Lady Beaumont looked at him for another moment, and then something shifted in her face that was not quite warmth and was not quite sorrow, and was a little of both. She said, "Then go and listen." The occasion came the following evening. Rowena had come to the music room because Edmund had left the door to it open, which was not something he had ever done in the 3 years the house had been his alone, and the fire had been lit, which was also not customary in November. And the piano stood open. She had paused in the corridor for a long time before she went in. She did not know, initially, that he was there. She sat at the piano in the low firelight, and she played for a few minutes, slowly, a piece she had learned in Northumberland from the music teacher, who came twice a week to the baronet's daughters, and then she had learned to play it for herself, and not for the lessons, and the difference was audible. She played it with the slight hesitation of a person who is not performing, but simply present, who makes small corrections mid-phrase and does not hide them, and who forgets, in the course of a passage that they love, to be careful. Edmund was in the armchair by the fire. He had been there when she came in, though she had not seen him in the low light. He sat very still, and he listened, and he watched her profile in the candlelight. And he understood, with a clarity that was slightly painful, what he had missed in the first year of their marriage. Not any single large thing, but the accumulated weight of small things, each of which was, by itself, negligible, and which together made a woman, and which he had not been present to collect. She stopped when she noticed him, not abruptly, but carefully, letting the phrase complete itself. He said, "Don't stop." She turned slightly on the bench. She looked at him, and he was looking at her, and there was a quality to how he was looking that she had not seen in the first year, that she had not seen before she left, a directness that was not his usual professional precision, but was something older and less managed. He said, "I have been thinking about what you said, about knowing you this time." He paused. "I am aware that an intention is not a practice. I am aware that I have said things before and found them difficult to act upon." He held her gaze steadily. "I am asking you not to leave when it is difficult, and I am asking you to tell me plainly when I am failing to attend. I will try to attend. I cannot promise I will always succeed, but I will try, and I will not resent being told." She looked at him for a long, still moment. He said, "Rowena." The fire shifted in the grate. The linden trees were bare now outside the music-room window, and the first frost had been on the grass that morning, and the house was very quiet. She said, "I am not Mrs. Hartfield." "I know," he said. "I am not your housekeeper." "I know that too." "I am your wife," she said. And it was not a question, and it was not a demand, but it had the quality of something being returned to its right name, something that had been called by the wrong name for a long time, and was now, quietly, being corrected. He rose from the chair and crossed the room, which was not a large room, and he stood beside the piano bench, and she looked up at him, and he reached out and offered his hand. Not in the formal way, not in the way of proprieties and drawing-room courtesies, but simply, plainly, palm upward. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her hand in his. He held it. He did not let go. He said very quietly, "I am aware of what I am asking." He said it with the precision that was native to him, the care for accuracy that was the one quality she had always known him to possess, even in the year when she had felt invisible. "I am asking you to stay, and to let me know you, and to believe that what I am now is not necessarily what I was. I understand that this requires trust I have not yet earned." He paused. "I am asking you to give me time to earn it." She said, "That is a great deal to ask." "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him steadily, in the firelight, in the music room, in the house that had been her house, and then his house, and was now, perhaps, something else. She said, "Play a hand of cards with me, tomorrow evening, in the sitting room. Not as my employer. As my husband." He said, "Yes." She said, "And ask me about Northumberland. Ask me what it was like before I came south." He said, "I will." She said, "And do not call me Mrs. Hartfield again." He said, "Rowena." And this time, he said it the way one says a name that one has been holding carefully for a long time, and is now permitted to hold without care, without the managed distance that keeping a name at arm's length requires. She closed her eyes briefly, and then opened them, and the amber in them caught the firelight. And she was quiet. He sat beside her on the piano bench, which was not a usual thing, not a proper thing by the standards of the drawing-room and the season, and she did not move away from him. And the fire burned steadily, and after a time she put her other hand on the keys and played a few notes, slowly, and then a few more, and he sat beside her and listened and did not speak, and attended. They were not discovered that evening, in any meaningful sense. Miss Louisa Kemp did not interrupt. Lady Beaumont, who had seen everything she needed to see and was too old and too wise to require more of a story than it chose to give, went to bed early with a glass of warm milk and a quiet satisfaction that had nothing smug in it and a great deal that was simply right. The formal restoration of Rowena's position as Countess of Ashfield was arranged quietly over the following weeks, through Fairclough's careful correspondence and a brief notice placed in the appropriate periodicals, and the household received it without surprise, because the household had known for some time, with the particular intelligence of people who see everything and say nothing, that there was something about Mrs. Hartfield that was not quite what she claimed. Polly, the eldest under-housewoman, said she had known from the first week because of the way she looked at the kitchen garden, and because a woman who looked at a kitchen garden that way had once had something to do with its planning. The portrait in the gallery was taken down in late November, at Rowena's request. She did not ask for it to be destroyed. She asked for it to be moved to the storage room, carefully, and for the brass plate to be removed and kept, not because she wanted it, but because it had been his grief, even if grief was the wrong word for it, and things that had been grief deserved to be kept somewhere. Edmund went with her when the portrait was moved. He stood in the gallery and watched the footman carry it past him, and Rowena stood beside him, and he did not say anything for a long time, and she did not make him. Then he said, "I should like to commission a new one." She said, "Of what?" He said, "Of you, as you are. Not from a miniature." She looked at him. She said, "I am wearing gray wool." He said, "I know what you are wearing." He said it in a tone that was not quite dry and not quite warm, and was something that she had not heard from him in the first year of their marriage, had not known he was capable of, and which made the corner of her mouth move very slightly. She said, "The sitting room has good light in the mornings." He said, "I know." By Christmas, the house had a different quality about it. Not transformed. Edmund was not a man who transformed. He was a man who altered slowly and specifically, the way a very good piece of furniture settles into a room, making itself felt, without announcing itself. There were small things, though. The music room door was left open in the evenings. The card table in the sitting room was used more than it had been in 3 years. There was a fire kept in the library on mornings when the frost was hard, and 2 cups, not 1, on the tray. Rowena learned over those weeks what she had not known in their first year. He had a habit of reading with one hand pressed over his eyes when the thing he was reading required genuine concentration, and that he did not like sweet wine but had never said so, and that he had been fond of his younger brother, who had died in the year before their marriage, and whose death was the wound he carried, the thing he had never told her, the reason for a sternness that was partly nature and partly protection against a loss he had not yet learned to carry openly. She told him, in exchange, about Northumberland and the music teacher, and the way the light came off the sea on the clearest days in July, and he listened with the whole of his attention, which was, she was learning, his most particular quality, the one that had simply been directed in their first year, at the wrong things entirely. On Christmas Eve it snowed. It came down in the soft, slow way of first snow, settling on the bare linden trees and on the kitchen garden and on the stone balustrade of the terrace, and Rowena stood at the music room window and looked out at it, and Edmund came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and they were quiet together for a time, watching the park go white. He had asked her about Northumberland, and she had told him. He had played cards with her in the sitting room on Tuesday evenings, and he had lost twice, which was not because he played badly, but because she played better, and he had received this information with an expression that was as near to amused as she had ever seen him manage. The portrait sitting had been arranged for January, in the good morning light of the sitting room, and she had agreed to it. And the agreement had felt like a small and deliberate choosing. She said, without turning from the window, "It is strange to have come back." He said, "Is it?" "To have walked in at the servants' entrance," she said, "and organized the linen press, and thought that I might stay the winter and not be known." She paused. "I was not sure I wanted to be known," he said. "And now?" She turned from the window then and looked at him. And his face in the winter light was the composed, angular face she had first seen across a dinner table years ago. And there was something in it now that she had not seen then. Something that was learning to be readable. She said, "Now I think I would rather be known than safe." He reached out and took her hand, as he had taken it in the music room, with the plain, unglamorous directness of a man who has spent a long time being careful and is choosing, deliberately, to stop. She let him hold it. She turned back to the window, and he stood beside her. And outside the snow came down on the park that was theirs, on the bare trees and the stone and the kitchen garden laid out in white. And the house was warm behind them. And it was enough, for now, to stand here and be known, and to know, and to let that knowing be the beginning of something that was not perfect, and was not without cost, but was, at last, chosen by both of them. The piano stood open in the room behind them. She had left it mid-phrase again. She would come back to it. She always came back.